Good morning, everyone. We're starting. I'm Rima Majid, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies here at AUB. In my name and in the name of my colleagues at the department, I would like to welcome you all to this very exciting conference. Today, we are launching the Arabic version of the World Social Science Report, a major publication in the field of social sciences that attempts to capture the state of our world and our society's most pressing issues. This important report is published once every 3 years by the International Social Science Council in partnership with the UNESCO, and it is produced by some of the most prominent social scientists globally. Over the next 2 days, we will have a rich program and very distinguished speakers and participants debating the report and addressing its main topic, social inequalities from a multidimensional, global, and regional perspective. The idea of this conference stems directly from the recommendations of the report itself, a pressing need to rethink or to think of inequalities more intersectionally and to address the inequalities of knowledge production by engaging in social science debates beyond the Eurocentric or Western-centric world. Addressing inequalities is surely not a new topic for social scientists, but it's definitely one that has made a strong comeback in the past decade. The interest in studying inequalities has historically gone through various waves, waning down at times and peaking at others. Similarly, the topic has attracted researchers from different schools of thought, different disciplines, and different methodological leanings and approaches. However, despite the ebbs and flows in the study of inequality, actual social inequalities have unfortunately remained a pertinent aspect of our societies and one that we cannot overlook as social scientists or policymakers, especially in times of crisis. Since the financial crisis of 2008, it has become clear, once again, that inequality and social justice are at the core of understanding our societies. In fact, the most recent wave of interest in studying inequality probably dates back to the 80s and 90s when neoliberalism became a dominant paradigm. However, more recent events such as the Arab uprisings of 2011, the food riots in Mexico and Venezuela, the Occupy movement, the Indignados, and other anti-austerity movements in Europe, and maybe most recently the uprisings in Basra in southern Iraq, are all putting back inequality on the agenda of global political as well as academic debates. But really, why are we having yet another conference on inequality? I would say for two main reasons. Today we have enough evidence that inequalities have reached unimaginable levels. Almost half of the world's household wealth is owned by 1% of global population. We know that the richest 62 individuals globally own as much as the bottom half of humanity, so around 3.5 billion. These numbers in themselves are enough for us to want to know more about inequalities. But also, and more importantly, we're having this conference today because of our belief in the importance of social science research, not only in understanding inequality, but also in challenging it. In fact, some of the most important movements that challenged inequalities in gender, environment, knowledge production, and other spheres have stemmed from the work of engaged academics, thinkers, and theorists. This is a message of hope for us as academics and an invitation for a more public and engaged type of social science research. Finally, before we proceed, I would like to thank my partners at UNESCO and the Arab Forum for Alternative, Saiko and Muhammad, and also Cynthia, Mona, and Shaima, and the rest of the team, for their amazing energy and for making this event possible. It has been an honor for me to be part of the team that has worked on launching the World Social Science Report in Arabic. I would also like to thank my colleagues here at AUB. I want to start by thanking Dean Nadia Sheikh for her unwavering support and encouragement. I also want to thank our chairwoman, Dr. Livia Wick, for being attentive to all the details and for always being supportive. And I also want to thank Professor Sari Hanafi, the head of the sociology unit, who's to thank not only for his support and for introducing me to the UNESCO partners, but also for being a great example of how social science research could go beyond the university. Finally, I want to thank the amazing media team at AUB, the IT team, and especially Habib here at College Hall, the translators, the photographers, and of course our graduate assistants who will be around during those 2 days to help with any questions you have. I would like now to give the floor to Dean Nadia Sheikh, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at AUB. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, excellencies, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Regional Roundtable on Addressing Inequalities in the Arab Region. This conference is the fruit of a partnership between AUB's Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Media Studies, the UNESCO, and the Arab Forum for Alternatives. The conference's main objective is to launch the Arabic version of the World Science Report entitled Challenging Inequalities, Pathways to a Just World. It is indeed a timely and most pressing issue in our region to tackle social inequalities as manifested since the Arab uprisings in 2011. Scholars have pointed to the extremely high rates of inequality, notably youth unemployment perhaps, as being a main reason for these uprisings and the consequent turmoils that we have been living. It is fundamental to develop multidimensional understanding of inequalities, focusing not only on the economic factors, but also on the political, social, cultural, environmental, spatial, and knowledge-based dimensions. As the report that you will be discussing conveys, and I'm quoting, if we take inequality seriously, we need serious social science research into the long-term impact of inequality on people's lives, end quote. The awareness of knowledge-based inequality is one of the main reasons for the translation of this report into Arabic and its launch at this conference. Our department here at AUB has played an important role in advancing the research agenda on inequalities and continues to produce knowledge through supporting the IDAFAT, the Arab Journal of Sociology, that aims to provide a platform for all Arab social scientists to publish and engage in academic exchanges. I'm delighted with this collaboration, and I would like to thank Dr. Rima Majid for her active involvement in organizing this important conference here at AUB. I sincerely hope that the discussions over the next 2 days will be very productive and will lead to more collaborations towards equity and inclusion in our communities. I thank you.
I'd like now to invite Mr. Hamid Hamami, the Regional Director of UNESCO, to the floor.
سعادة الدكتور, let us turn to Arabic. سعادة الدكتورة نادية الشيخ, عميدة كلية الآداب والعلوم, حضرات الخبراء, أصحاب السعادة, الزملاء والشركاء, السيدات والسادة, يسرني بالنيابة عن مدير مكتب اليونسكو الإقليمي للتربية في الدول العربية الدكتور حامد الهمامي أن أتشرف بحضوركم، وبالنيابة عن زملائي في اليونسكو معنا اليوم من باريس جون، ومن بيروت سايكو، وجميع الزملاء من مكتب اليونسكو، أرحب بكم وأتقدم بجزيل الشكر والعرفان لهذه الجامعة العريقة لاستضافة حفل إطلاق النسخة العربية لتقرير العلوم الاجتماعية لعام 2016. السيدات والسادة، إن منظمة اليونسكو في جميع مجالات عملها تطور تقارير عالمية تعمل كمنصات للتأمل والتفكير المعمق، وترصد الواقع وتضع آفاق للمستقبل، وغالبا ما تكون برامج أعمال عالمية تستمر لعشرات السنين. هو نفس الحال في العلوم الاجتماعية كما هو الحال في العلوم التربوية. حيث شكلت في العلوم الاجتماعية التقارير على مر السنين مصادر لمعارف علمية ورسائل قائمة على أدلة يشارك في إعدادها خبراء ومهنيين من جميع أنحاء العالم، ويتم توجيه هذه التقارير بصور واضحة وبصوت عالي إلى صانع السياسات وإلى الممارسين والمهتمين. الحضور الكريم، إن التقرير الذي بيننا والذي بين أيدينا اليوم هو عن تحدي عدم المساواة، يعبر عن واقع التحديات التي يعيشها العالم من ارتفاع حالات عدم المساواة وتأثيرها على النمو الاقتصادي والاجتماعي، وكذلك تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة التي تم التوافق عليها عالمياً للتنفيذ حتى سنة 2030. ويأتي التقرير ورسائله الهامة في لحظة حاسمة تعيشها المنطقة العربية، تغييرات غير مسبوقة نأسف أنها سلبية في معظمها، مع وجود بعض الإيجابيات كمحاولات للنهوض الاقتصادي والاستقرار السياسي بعد سنوات عجاف من عدم الاستقرار والنزاع الداخلي الذي للأسف ما زال مستمر في بعض المناطق ويستنزف الكثير. وتشكل عدم المساواة أحد الأسباب الرئيسية في هذه النزاعات بكل أبعادها. والحل هو التوجه نحو مسارات لتحقيق الإنصاف والعدالة الاجتماعية كما أتى في التقرير الذي بين أيدينا. ومن هنا والوضع الحالي في منطقتنا العربية يجب أن يكون تناولنا لهذا التقرير من هذا المنحى، كيف تستفيد المنطقة العربية من رسائل هذا التقرير. الزملاء والخبراء، يتوجه التقرير إلى تناول قضية عدم المساواة بأبعاد شمولية، ليس فقط البعد الاقتصادي كما هو سائد دائما في أبحاثنا، ولكن الأبعاد السبعة التي سماها التقرير: البعد السياسي والاجتماعي والثقافي والبيئي والمكاني والمعرفي. هذا توجه لنا كباحثين ومهتمين أن يكون التوجه في البحوث الاجتماعية والتربوية أيضا متعدد القطاعات ومتعدد التخصصات، وأبحاث طولية أو طويلة البدء أو طويلة الأمد تستخدم المنهجية الكيفية وكذلك المنهجية الكمية حسب التناسب أو حسب وضع البحث. ويعزز التقرير فهمنا لأبعاد وآثار عدم المساواة المتعددة التداخلات واتجاهات عدم المساواة في كثير من البلدان تم رصدها في هذا التقرير للاستفادة منها. كذلك رصد التقرير التأثيرات المستقبلية لاستمرار تحدي عدم المساواة على التنمية. يضع التقرير بين أيدينا مسارات للحلول ونماذج وجدول أعمال للبحوث في العلوم الاجتماعية لتحليل عدم المساواة تحليل دقيق ومعمق، وكيفية تحقيق الإنصاف والعدالة الاجتماعية. سميت في التقرير تغيير القواعد، وسميت أيضا المسارات التحويلية، منها على سبيل المثال التوجه نحو سياسات التنمية الشمولية في الاقتصاد والتعليم والعمل والأجر اللائق، وكذلك منح سياسات إعادة توزيع الثروة والحماية الاجتماعية للفئات المهمشة، وكثيرا ما نتكلم عن الحوكمة، ولكن الحوكمة الشاملة والرشيدة. وأعطى التقرير اهتماما خاصا لإنتاج المعرفة حول عدم المساواة وسيرورات الإدماج الاجتماعي، ووضع التقرير جدول أعمال جديد للبحوث الاجتماعية يتخطى الثغرات السابقة، يتخطى ثغرات نقع فيها كباحثين، ويدعو التقرير إلى الاستثمار في الفجوة المعرفية في مجال العلوم الاجتماعية، ويدعو إلى تغيير المسارات في البحوث الاجتماعية نحو بحوث متعددة التخصصات متعددة الثقافات تفضي إلى المعرفة التحويلية. في النهاية آمل أن يكون التقرير فرصة للتأمل ومرتكزا للانطلاق نحو مسارات تحويلية معرفية وللتطبيق لصانع القرار لتحقيق الإنصاف والعدالة الاجتماعية وتحقيق التنمية الشاملة والمستدامة في منطقتنا العربية. أود هنا أن أشكر بالعرفان مؤسسة سلطان بن العزيز الخيرية للترجمة، وهو برنامج كبير في اليونسكو بدأ من أكثر من 15 عام، ساعد اليونسكو في الترجمة إلى اللغة العربية وثائق أساسية. دائما كانت تترجم إلى اللغة العربية الإنجليزية والفرنسية والأسبانية. الآن لدينا برنامج في اليونسكو يساعدنا، اسمه برنامج سلطان بن العزيز للترجمة للغة العربية، فساعدنا في هذه النسخة العربية. لابد أن نشكرهم على هذا الجهد. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Last but not least, I would like to invite Mr. Mohammed Al-Agati, Director of the Arab Forum for Alternatives.
Dear participants, let me first thank Dr. Nadia Sheikh for hosting this event and all the AUB team and the UNESCO for the support, and our honored guests and speakers who came from different countries across the Arab region and beyond, and also to all you present here today with us. It is an honor for the Arab Forum for Alternatives to be a part of this project, and we hope that our contribution in it will bring additional value to our two prestigious partners, the American University in Beirut and the UNESCO. Before proceeding with our subject, inequality, allow me first to give you a brief overview of the Arab Forum for Alternatives and the work that it has been doing in the region. After 10 years in Egypt, AFA moved to Beirut beginning of this year. We are familiar with Beirut, as for Egypt 10 years, we never stopped coming to my favorite city, Beirut, for hosting events and other activities. As a research organization working to consecrate values of scientific thoughts in Arab societies, the AFA addressed political, economic, and social problems away from political propaganda with a framework that respects of political and social diversity and global human values. During the 10 years of work, AFA was able to rise a distinguished position within its field. It was always on the index of the different organizations doing ranking for think tank and research center. We have been classified or ranked in the top position in the field of advocacy in Egypt in 2016. From the main topics on AFA agenda during the last 5 years, social justice, alternative economy, and inequality, or what we prefer to call it in our literature, social disparities. Socioeconomic transformations that accompanied globalization underlined the significance of the issues of social disparities on the international level. Its significance is mainly driven from the effect of this transformation on social justice, which in turn influence development, stability, economic growth, and all of the Millennium Development Goals. It affects different social disparities contribute a direct threat to economic growth, since poverty and inequality in accessing basic services such as education and healthcare. These policies had a negative impact on socioeconomic conditions of Arab citizens, especially marginalized groups as women and minorities. From here comes the importance of our event and the discussion of the report that the UNESCO published in 2016 in English, and you are here to not just to present the Arabic version, but also to make a discussion about the topic and to try to put an agenda for further work in this field. I would like to thank you again, and I leave the panel to Rima Magid, that I would like to thank also for all her efforts for coordinating.
Thank you, Mohammed. I have the honor now to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Asfar Khan, who is a renowned economist and the forum head of research and policy at the International Labour Organization. Dr. Khan has served with the ILO for well over 2 decades. During his period at the ILO, he undertook many assignments, including the head of policy research in the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch. He was also the senior migration specialist for the Arab states based at the ILO's regional office in Beirut. Prior to that, he was the senior migration policy advisor at the International Migration Program. He was also the development economist and deputy director of the Program on Socioeconomic Security. And finally, he was the technical advisor on population and poverty in the Development Policies Department. Prior to joining the ILO, Dr. Khan was a senior lecturer at the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague in the Netherlands. He also served as the director of the UNFPA Global Program of Training in Population and Development. He's a life member of the Basic Income Earth Network and also represents the Global Coalition on Living Wage. Dr. Khan has retired at the end of last year, and he was expecting, as he said, to spend a life of leisure, tending to his garden, reading, and listening to his music. However, Dr. Khan is still very heavily involved in many projects related to implementing a universal basic income, particularly in Africa. Dr. Khan is a holder of a BA of Honors in Economics, an MA of Economics from McGill University in Canada, and a PhD from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Khan. Thank you.
Thank you for your very kind words, Rima, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this meeting. And as a keynote speaker, no less, I'm really, really very honored to be here and to participate in the meeting. You know, for 5 years I lived here in Beirut, just over down the hill from here in Jalal Bahar, right at the entrance of the American Community School and the IC. And the highlight of my day was walking through the campus to my office in Clemenceau, and that I used to do every day. Although I used to go there through the universities, I have never been able to figure out why they stopped me from going back that way. That way I had to go all the way down Bliss and then back to the office. Well, anyways, I'll start on the topic at hand, on addressing inequalities from a global perspective. One might think that talking about inequality and its manifestation would be a fairly routine chore. After all, the issue has been touted by academics, by social and political activists, by labor representatives, and also by policymakers as one of the salient concerns in our world today. President Obama, for example, called it the defining challenge of our time. Pope Francis tweeted that inequality is the root of all social evil. Closer to home, Sharon Burrow, the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation, when addressing the UN General Assembly, was very scathing in a remark in saying that inequality is a poison that is destroying livelihoods, stripping families of dignity, and splitting communities. But it is not just those of the liberal persuasion who have expressed serious concern about inequality. Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve in the United States, who was a self-styled libertarian and quite a devotee of Ayn Rand, called inequality as the most dangerous trend afflicting the United States. However, even though a tacit agreement may be ascertained over the political spectrum, it tends to break down on the ethical level on the intrinsic aspects of equality and inequality. The picture is not so clear as one might think. A few weeks ago, when I started researching for my address, I was looking at some material on the internet sites like Evonomics and Information Clearinghouse, Wall Street Journal, Project Syndicate, and others, and I came across 50 articles on the subject which had been written in the space of 1 month. So it's a very hot kind of a topic. And of course, there were two sides of the coin. The arguments in these articles ranged from those submitted by professed defenders and apologists of inequality to those expressing a vitriol criticism of the outcomes. And these discussions about inequality tend to get quite ideologically turbocharged. There seems to be unbridgeable schisms between diametrically opposed views, all held passionately, each invoking sound theory, strong evidence, scientific methods, and sturdy ethics in support. Those who defend inequality range in their arguments from denying the evidence of high and rising inequality and or its damaging consequences, and argue that it is a regrettable necessity in the development of humankind, and debating again in a very libertarian way in favor of extreme inequality as proof of free society and thus being intrinsically just. Now, the core position that inequality is naturally good, of course, originates from the ideas of Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, the self-styled gurus of neoliberalism. And the ideological justification of the beliefs is essentially provided by Robert Nozick in his entitlement theory of justice. Their concern, the concern of Hayek and Friedman, was with what Isaiah Berlin called negative liberty, in which the individuals were deemed to be free of control. For Hayek and Friedman, this meant the control of the state, which was identified as the oppressing agent. Hayek and Friedman were not really concerned about the other concept of Isaiah Berlin, which was positive liberty, which endowed individuals and citizens with the capacities to participate as equal citizens and to achieve higher levels of individual and group development and fulfillment. This was swept under the rug. So they dealt only with negative liberty, but did not really talk about the positive liberty. One of the seminal historians of our time, R.H. Tawney, talking about a past era, noted, and I quote, "The rulers of mankind maintained side by side two standards of social ethics without the risk of their colliding, keeping one set of values for use and another set for display. They combined with conscious insincerity the moral satisfaction of idealistic principles with the material advantages of realistic practices." Unfortunately, Tawney's words still hold true in this age. However, in the present world, it is becoming increasingly difficult to stop the professed and the real from crashing into one another. Thus, those who have benefited from the outcome of this emerging inequality, in protecting their position, become increasingly aggressive and disingenuous in defense and are forever looking for ways, no matter how tendentious, to put in a good word for it. As a renowned academic once put it, inordinate amount of time has been and energy seems to have gone into making grotesque truths behind and masking them behind camouflaging cosmetics. The academic Ashwani Seth quite astutely notes that also that inequalities reflect hierarchies of power, and they tend to protect and reproduce their privileged position regardless of the force of intellectual and ethical arguments against this unacceptable manifestation. Even John Rawls, when he was sort of expounding his theory of justice, admitted that one could not simply expect society to move to achieve social justice. After all, why would the rich espouse ideas which result in the undermining of their superior position? Thus, while the so-called rulers of this world visibly nod in deference to ideals of equity and inclusiveness, they tend to reject it as far as possible in practice. The other side of the picture, as Rima pointed out, is of mounting evidence of growing inequalities, which is virtually incontrovertible. Despite neoconservative attempts at obfuscating the situation, an obstinate refusal to acknowledge its damaging consequences. Witness the comments of Brian Griffith, who is a principal advisor at Goldman Sachs, and who was also a special advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And while talking at a forum debating the morality in the marketplace, made the comment that we have to tolerate inequality as a way to achieve greater prosperity and opportunity for all. We all know that this is nothing more than a regurgitation of the trickle-down hypothesis, which has a long pedigree and, of course, has long been discredited. In recent years, there has been a deluge of reports, papers, and books which have provided and analyzed data demonstrating that inequality, rather than abating or subsiding, is getting worse. There is fairly clear evidence that inequality also, generated by concentration of income as it stands today, has depressed economic growth, worsened public health, and has had fairly negative influence on the social fabric of countries where distribution of income is particularly skewed. It is not just the poorer groups in society who have suffered, but a whole number of social groups have been affected. The research quite persuasively points out that, in a nutshell, the rising inequality is strongly correlated, and nothing is going to make you fall off your chair here, mass unemployment, the collapse of state social programs, and the impoverishment of the millions of people, working people all over the world, who are suffering while those on the top of the economic ladder are doing fine or have never done better. This is all well documented in the recent works of, among other, the late Anthony Atkinson, Joe Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, Guy Standing, and Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. But what is it about inequality that is bothersome? The philosopher and historian Gyan Prakash, presently the Dayton Stockton Professor of History at Princeton, in a pioneering paper which he wrote in 1986 on inequality, remarked that understanding how unequal relations are reproduced over time is as significant as understanding inequality itself. For unequal relations exist only in human practices that reproduce them. In a similar vein, the noted development economist of the dependencia area, Osvaldo Sunkel, while at the IDS, remarked that it is the processes which produce outcomes, and these outcomes will only change if the processes undergo a change. To this, I add Stiglitz and Atkinson's belief that only by understanding the phenomena we can provide more considered policies with more favorable outcomes. One may very well argue that inequality has always existed, and people have all through the centuries lived under unequal relationships. So what is the fuss all about? Even the Nobel Prize economist, the late Angus Deaton, remarked that, and I quote, "Inequality is a marker of success. Success breeds inequality, and you don't want to choke off success." But to be fair, he goes on to qualify that there is nothing inherently bad about inequality, although there is nothing inherently bad about it. Whether it is bad depends on how it comes about and what it does. In a similar vein, John Rawls, in explaining his theory of redistributive justice, which advocated the well-being of the worst off in society, did not disagree with a degree of inequality which is in everyone's interest. He argued that if a policy raised inequality but also raised the income of the worse off, then it would be fair to introduce it. But if inequality led to a lowering of living standards of the worst off, then it was unjust. More recently, Thomas Piketty, in his work Capital in the 21st Century, suggested that inequality should not be dismissed offhand. We need some inequality to grow. But excessive and extreme inequality can be harmful for growth because it reduces mobility and can lead to political capture of democratic institutions. A couple of days ago, I was reading an article by Raj Shetty, and The Economist, and some of his colleagues at Stanford University under the Inequality Project. And they found that there has been a decline in social and income mobility in the United States, and that most of the decline in this mobility is driven by the more unequal distribution of economic growth rather than the slowdown in aggregate growth rates. And I'm quite ready and interested in hearing Jad Shaban's view when he talks about social mobility in Lebanon and how that has come about. Indeed, it is not so much that inequality exists, but the form that it takes and what is associated with the form. To quote the late Angus Deaton again, inequality is not the same thing as unfairness. And it is unfairness which has incited so much political and social turmoil in the rich world today. True. But one could very legitimately argue that it is the prevailing form of inequality which is associated with so much unfairness prevalent in the world today. Today's inequality has endowed at one end of the spectrum the chosen few with economic and political power, while at the other end it has sapped energies and denied and continues to deny the less fortunate opportunities to advance themselves. And that is the root of unfairness. There is simply no set of a priori rules that can protect society from drifting into a state of inequality that cannot be defended by efficiency arguments, and which would be considered unacceptable by everyone when the social contract is negotiated. As mentioned, high levels of inequality have suggested imbalances in political and economic power, as those at the top have used their economic muscle to shape politics in ways that give them even more power and political control. Predictably, the system shaped by the control of the powerful even takes away the fundamental right of decision-making of the socially and economically vulnerable and insecure, and deprives them of the right and opportunities to shape their own destinies. So in a sense, if the poor want to do something, you see, there is always that kind of a paternalism that comes about and says, oh, they are uneducated, they are poor, we know what to do for them, we can do a better job and and advance certain kind of policies. So economic paternalism then prevails, which ensures the low standing in society of the disenfranchised in every which way. There are rising concerns about unequal opportunity and about social mobility as the distributions of income and wealth become more and more unequal. In other words, to use Tony Atkinson's terminology, the growing inequality of outcome is undermining the equality of opportunity. And this is the heart of the matter. The relevant question to ask is, how has this excessive inequality come about and what it has meant for the populations at large? This is fundamentally a question of social justice and the furthering of inalienable rights, the progress on which seems to have stalled. The novelist John Lanchester, have you heard of him? John Lanchester. He wrote a wonderful book on the 2008 crisis called Whoops, Why Everybody Owes Everybody and Nobody Can Pay. And he started off by writing, looking at the crisis and wanting to write a novel. But he said the crisis in itself was so interesting that no novel could do it any justice. So in that book, he says that rising inequality is not a law of nature. It is not even a law of economics. It is a consequence of political and economic arrangements, and those arrangements can be changed. In other words, what he is saying that it is all about policy or policies. Indeed, in 2017, the OECD published a report entitled Society at a Glance, which highlighted the staggering rise of poverty, hunger, unemployment, and social distress in countries throughout the world in the aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis. The report as such was a damning indictment of the capitalist system and the economic and social policies pursued by governments throughout the world. However, it would be misleading to believe that it was only the 2008 crisis from which all the ills emerged. In fact, the wheels were in spin long before then. The turning point came in 1980 when Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party came into power in the UK and Ronald Reagan won the presidency of the United States in America. This is when new liberal ideology gained ascendancy and began to influence economic and social policies. These policies were institutionalized under the banner of what we know now as the Washington Consensus, and somewhat forced application of which by the Washington-based international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which has become synonymous with what we call globalization. So what did the globalization policy package, which we now associate with producing extreme inequality and a bipolar world, propose? Fundamentally, it pushed for free and unfettered markets and commensurately advocated for, one, the liberalization of financial and capital markets globally, two, the promotion of free trade, three, the securing of individual property rights over physical and financial assets, four, the privatization of public assets and social policy, five, a reduction in the size and role of the public sector, including privatization of publicly owned productive assets and an end to managed trade and industrial policies, and six, for labor flexibility, as Guy Standing so aptly puts it, which led to the dismantling of institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity, which in their view were rigidities holding back the market. I could talk about these policies at length, about how they have led to slower and more volatile economic growth, unstable trade and financial flows, loss of policy control by national governments, and the fiscal problems that have been engendered, about how the taxation system has morphed from a progressive orientation to a regressive one, and how the deregulation has shifted the locus of power to the financial sector. But that is not the intent of my talk here. Today, I would like to focus on the outcomes and the havoc that these policies have wreaked in the lives of the majority of the world's population, particularly the working people, and in shredding the social fabric of communities and how it has happened. Guy Standing makes a cogent point that with the advent of these policies, the whole distributive architecture changed. In the post-Second World War period, world leaders made an unprecedented commitment to the promotion of social and economic security. The world was expected to move steadily to a situation in which citizens of the industrialized world were protected by social services, transfers, and institutions that provided a dense network of security from cradle to the grave. A system was carved out which rewarded entrepreneurship and innovation and provided incentives for hard work. At the same time, it defended individual liberties and tried to ensure a fairly equal distribution of material benefits to sustain a social compact between classes and provide protection to those at the lower rungs of the income ladder. In most of the developing world, even if there was awareness that it was not possible quickly to provide this type of security, there was a commitment to achieve it. Economic growth and development were built on security, to strengthen security. The means and the ends were the same, were twins. This was the social democratic phase of modern capitalism. 60 years on, this has given way to a world controlled by what we call big pharma, big finance, and big tech, which have connived to forge a global architecture of institutions strengthening rentier capitalism and maximizing monopolistic income from intellectual property. Indeed, what is shaping the global economy today and leading to excessive inequality is the growth of this rentier capitalism. Let me explain. Rentier capitalism is essentially one where income is gained not through the creation of value, but by virtue of ownership of assets, be they physical, financial, or proprietal. That is, patents, trademarks, copyrights, and the like. Estimates suggest that 25% of the world's GDP today, at present, is made up of economic rents, and that amounts to $18 trillion. Now, just imagine how much this has grown. The same figure for 1990 was $620 billion, and now it's $18 trillion. So in the space of literally 28 years, it has grown, I don't know how many fold, 100,000s of fold. And this proportion is progressively increasing. It seems that the path we are treading now is leading us back to the old age of feudal vassalage, one where the society's income distribution is intrinsically being shaped by the distribution of inherited and acquired wealth. So by capturing the democratic institutions, the powerful and wealthy have taken advantage of the market and political power to further enrich themselves at the expense of the rest. As one would expect, the policy preferences have tended to reinforce the status quo of inequality. The upshot of such development, of course, is that it has led to situations of economic security and social exclusion for many. I will give 3 examples of how this happens. Let me first take the issue of privatization of public goods, which Standing recently referred to as the modern plunder of the commons, where the transfer of countries' common resources is passed into the hands of the rich and wealthy. Think of public parks, public utilities, water, railways, energy, garbage collection, highways. Such government programs which give away a country's resources to the powerful and well-connected increase inequality and quite perversely require the vulnerable and the poor to pay rent upwards as user fees and the like. The second example is the privatization of social policy, which impedes access of the vulnerable and the poor to essential services like health and education, partly because of the progressive decline in government benefits, and requires these people in the process of, to increasingly fend for themselves. Take the example of the United States, where people's lives have been irreparably damaged because they cannot afford the cost of health care. Moreover, Stiglitz points out in his book, The Price of Inequality, that access to education has become more selective and naturally favors the offspring of the wealthy and the rich. We can see the undermining of the equality of opportunity here and restrictions on social and economic mobility emerging from this kind of a process. However, the example of the United States pales in comparison to what is going on in the developing world, where such measures and their impact is far more pronounced. Corruption inside, many regimes in the developing world went down this road in trying to secure investment funds for the development and had to comply with conditionalities imposed by the Bretton Woods institutions, in which privatization of social services was a key demand. So, you have a lot of these people, these poor people living in developing countries who do not have access to these essential services. Look, if you give me a hospital or a school, I won't be too concerned about, if I run it as a private enterprise, I'm not too concerned about who can access my services. I will provide services to all those if they can pay for it. But otherwise, you see, I have a private business to run. So what happens then, that the whole structure more or less sort of falls apart. The third example that I would like to present is of the growth of intellectual property and rental income, owned through copyright laws, patents and trademark applications. I talked about how they have grown. These are intangible assets which generate economic rents derived from natural or contrived scarcity, enabling companies and individuals to gain income simply by virtue of possession. As far as intellectual property goes, the state creates and reinforces regulations and laws that generate vast rental income from patent, copyrights, brands, and trademarks. And it seems that the spread of intellectual property has been mainly for purpose other than rewarding or supporting innovation. Many patented inventions and copyrights are actually derived from publicly subsidized research. So the question is, why should an individual or corporations gain all the income? After all, the society made this income possible. I'll give you an example of Tim Berners-Lee. You know about Tim Berners-Lee? He was the man who invented or came up with the World Wide Web. That's the www you put in front of all URLs, right? And he did not take out a patent on it because he felt that as his research was financed by public funds, it was ethically and morally wrong for him to do so. And he said this had to be a public good. Now think about it. Google, Amazon, eBay, Facebook, all of these are built on it. Had he taken out a patent, he would have been a billionaire himself. I mean, much more so than Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos and all these other guys who would have had to pay him for things. In retrospect, one would have thought that he should have taken out a patent, got this money, and then redistributed it in some ways to the deserving. In the past, even in the Industrial Revolution, when you think about it, there were no patents that were taken out for the steam engine or for the spinning wheel, which made the Industrial Revolution possible. The public also bears much of the risk for which intellectual property rights are reportedly created. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the American state and also the third president of the United States, opposed copyright as being a tax on knowledge. But in this era of rentier capitalism, governments around the world have granted monopolies over knowledge to private interests, allowing them to restrict public access to knowledge and to raise the price of obtaining it or of services and products embodying it. There are stiff copyright rules which restrict access to books and articles, including educational materials and scientific papers. Access is essentially controlled by powerful media companies such as Elsevier, Springer, Taylor & Francis, and Wiley that charge enormous subscription fees to libraries of the universities that produce the research in the first place, and usually for free. Yeah? And that they're selling back to them at exorbitant prices. This is what Peter Baldwin, in his book, The Copyright Wars, termed a notorious rent-seeking boondoggle. Yet the modern state has strengthened patent protection, granting a tiny minority a monopoly income for 20 years, while copyright can last up to 95 years. This rental income, largely gained from society's generosity, is augmented by large government subsidies, mostly in the forms of tax breaks, without any obligation to give back to a society. It is an injustice, and it needs to be reversed. The policies promoting the development described above and the promotion of labor flexibility in the production process, which I will discuss shortly, are to my mind the main factors responsible for the present state of extreme inequality. In effect, the crux of these policies has essentially been to subordinate the public interest to the private one. And the resulting inequality has come about not as a result of free operations of the market, but as a predicted consequence of institutional interventions deploying an ideological agenda. As we all know now, the 2008 financial crisis did not just happen. The meltdown of the financial markets was the result of institutionalized fraud and financial manipulation. Okay, let's move on to considering a more micro-oriented economic and social impact. There is ample research which suggests that the economic and social policies pressed on the populations of the world in recent years have eroded networks of support and social solidarity, increasing the vulnerability of vast majority and inhibiting productive initiative. The resulting insecurity has bred social tensions that have wrecked prospects of generating a sustained economic growth and development. The question that then arises is, who exactly are the losers? Who are these people who have been made economically and socially insecure? And again, in this recent book, Standing, which is called The Corruption of Capitalism, and the byline of which is Why Rentiers Thrive and Work Does Not Pay, reflects that just as industrial capitalism defined a class structure, so too has rentier capitalism. He provides a framework of such a structure which has emerged over the last 30 years. At the top of the pyramids are the so-called 1%, the elite, the winners, the plutocrats, and the oligarchs, mainly to be found in the developed world, but also growing in Asia and in the emerging economies. Below them are the salariat and the professions, who have still regulatory protection, but for many the wage earnings have suffered. The professions, many of whom are freelance professionals, earn well but enjoy very little institutional support, and their well-being is essentially determined by the skills they can sell. Both of these classes, for the moment, enjoy secure status, but social and economic stresses are growing, and as are obligations, and if the situation persists, their social and economic security may also suffer, and you may have a greater inequality emerging. The ones who have grabbed the short end of the stick are what Standing calls the precariat, and he wrote also a book by this name, whose economic position has constantly been undermined by policies enacted and the process at play. The flexibilization of labor is perhaps the key element in this. A major feature of the currently orthodox neoliberal model of growth is that labor insecurity in the guise of flexibility, flexibility promotes labor insecurity, is portrayed as a desirable, if not the sole sustainable engine of growth. The flexibility introduced in the labor market has essentially meant a global informalization of economic activity, involving a spread of forms of work which are not covered by protective regulatory and social protection systems. Regular work is declining, irregular work is growing. How is this happening? This is linked in part to technological change and globalization, and has involved more turnover of firms and more use of subcontracting and production chains, and a tendency to contract out the employment function by making more use of external labor, such as contract workers, out workers, home workers, agency labor, temporary workers, and teleworkers. That's the kind of a thing that is happening. It has also meant a flexibilization of the wage system, which is actually quite pronounced in the developing world, with a movement from fixed to flexible wages, and the monetization of remuneration, such as putting an emphasis on piece rates and on accomplishing certain targets. A greater use of bonuses have also been employed in this regard. Through this flexibilization, the employers have been able to cut their costs and augment their profits. Another source of insecurity for the precariat, nurtured by these neoliberal policies, has been the loss of voice. As a result of deunionization, erosion of tripartite institution, and the changing character of collective bargaining. Some in the precariat do, but a vast number cannot rely on an institutional structure of support that can advance their interests. So you may have all kinds of security, but if you don't have a body, a representative body arguing for your interests, then you naturally tend to be insecure. In the 20th century, welfare states, labor law, collective bargaining, trade unions, and labor and social democratic parties were built by and for this group, for the precariat. However, that structure is falling apart and is fast losing progressive energy and direction. As such, the precariat is being forced to accept and is being habituated to a life of unstable labor without any representation. Their numbers are growing and are being continuously fed by, among other, college students, dropouts, women and migrant workers, and others. that now it seems that not only is social and economic security, which was taken for granted in the past, a barrier to growth, but there is also no reason to believe that it should be a major development goal as far as neoliberal policies are concerned. People are expected to adapt to a world of insecurity. In other words, ordinary workers and working communities are being obliged to bear most of the worst forms of insecurity, whereas large-scale asset holders are relatively well shielded. Along with the rise of unstable labor, the second dimension is distinctive relations of distribution or structure of social income. Now, the social income basically encompasses own production, wages, non-wage enterprise benefits, occupational benefits, community benefits, state benefits, private incomes, and family transfer. Think about your own life. Let's say you're working for a UN organization, or you're working for the university, you get paid a wage, but you have other protective measures behind you, other benefits that your employer provides for you. You have your private income, and which you can sort of rely on. You have a pension scheme later to bide you after retirement. So all these things are there, but they're not there for most of the people. The precariat, for example, relies mainly on money wages, which allows them to procure for themselves and their families the basic necessities of life, like food, clothing, housing, healthcare, recreation, and the wherewithal for their self-development. Worth mentioning here is a report on wage inequality released by OECD in 2017, which noted that the median wages in the OECD's 35 member countries were in 2016 still below where they were in 2007. For the bottom 10% of wage earners, the news was worse. Wages for the bottom decile declined by 6.6% in the 2007-2016 period. But wages rose for the top 10%. The report on wage inequality also found that inequality had increased in most countries. No part of the world was immune. Importantly, the report also found that the crisis had not only affected the number of jobs, but also their quality. Even in countries where labor market slack had been reabsorbed, low-quality jobs and high disparities among workers in terms of work contracts or job security weighed heavily on low-earning households and contributed to maintaining high levels of income inequality. The report mentioned that wages had been stagnant or falling in real terms for 3 decades. In the aftermath of the crisis, of the 2008 crisis, real wage growth had stalled in most countries, including those that were largely spared by the crash and the recession, for example, like Japan, and had fallen quite drastically in the countries that were hard hit, like Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom. The precariat also has been losing non-wage forms of remuneration, while the salariat and elite have been gaining them, making the growth of social income inequality greater than it appears in conventional income statistics. The precariat rarely receives paid holidays, paid medical leave, subsidized transport or accommodation, paid maternity leave, and so on. They have lost entitlement to rights-based benefit also, for example, the welfare that was given. In the developed world, there has been a movement from welfare to workfare. So the benefits that you were entitled to unconditionally in the past, you are not entitled to. You have to prove something to gain those kind of benefits. They most of these people live on the edge of unsustainable debt, knowing that one illness, accident, or mistake hazard, which are never far away, could render them totally destitute. Now, the precariat is becoming angrier, some supporting neo-fascism, others frustrated by a lack of progressive politics. The primary problem of this class is chronic insecurity and associated inability to develop meaningful and ecologically sustainable lives. Unless progressives devise a transformative strategy, neo-fascist populists and their regressive agenda will continue to pose a threat to a civilized future. Promoting a new income distribution system will offer a viable and attractive alternative. it also then becomes clear that any move towards resolving the inequality concerns must focus on the well-being of this group. So, what can we propose? What is the way forward in all this thing? Clearly, what we have are social entities that are at complete odds with the vision of a good society, the John Rawls vision. The question becomes, what do we do about all this? Piketty suggests that this is internally logical result of the development of capitalism. The upward distribution of income as exploitation accelerates through work speed-ups, layoffs, movement of production to low-wage havens, and the panoply of deregulatory measures resulting from corporate capture of government. He draws quite a pessimistic picture where high levels of inequality will persist rather than subside, both in the developed world as well as in the emerging economies, unless strong policy measures are taken to rein them in. Although he does provide a direction through the proposition of progressive taxation and the imposition of a global wealth tax, he sees little hope of such policies being enacted. But this needn't be so. Evidence that's available suggests that in countries of Northwest Europe and Japan, they have experienced much less inequality. And the concentration of income at the top that we see in the United Kingdom and the US and in the other Anglo countries is much less. In these countries with relatively much less inequality, incomes of the middle and the working classes and also the poor have gone up quite rapidly. Then, let's say, relative to the other countries. While their economies have grown more or less as fast and levels of material well-being for ordinary people have kept pace. This would suggest that more equal economies are not necessarily less dynamic, and more unequal economies are not necessarily better at raising mass living standard as default neoliberal thinking would have us believe. As the economist Robert Wade puts it, from this we can conclude that the trend towards rising concentration of wealth is not quite as hardwired into capitalism as Piketty seems to believe. Policies, institutions, and politics, all changeable, have more of a role in income distribution. More fatalistic passages in his book, they say. Constant policy adjustment in the form of redistributive policies which reduce inequality or economic outcomes would then contribute to enhancing the equality of opportunity. John Rawls always believed that unless the state acts to boost the well-being of the poor, it will be an unjust state. So in a sense, state intervention can work towards ameliorating and rectifying the damaging excess of inequality. Many much more qualified than myself, people like Atkinson, Stiglitz, Standing, J.T. Ghosh, Yanis Varoufakis, Diane Elson, Denny Rodericks, and many others have preferred the policy solution. The common thread that links these work is an argument for a more active role of the state. The solutions that are presented make it fairly clear that inequality can be reduced without the social costs of doing so outweighing the social benefits. So the solutions are there. The fundamental question is not economic or social in nature. We have to ask, is there a political will to change all this? Even if the new reversal of new liberal policies takes place anytime soon, the results will be long drawn out and not something that will be evident in the near future. The elite will not give up without a fight. In the meantime, immediate action also needs to be taken to assist those who have suffered the consequences. And indeed, action has been taken with the orthodoxy, with the neoliberalist approaches, advancing a social safety net type of approach to social protection, which has involved more targeting, selectivity, and conditionality, making benefits and social services available only for those identified by means tests and behavioral conditions. Food subsidies, food for work programs, targeting and means-tested benefits, public works, microcredit, social funds, vouchers, minimum income integration schemes, workfare, tax credits are some of the prominent ones falling under the social safety net rubric. However, evaluation of these schemes has shown them to be either expensive to administer, with a high bureaucratic overhang and transaction costs which gobble up funds ostensibly allocated for poverty relief, where the benefits of any new development are appropriated by the better off in society, particularly where means testing is involved, where the take-up is low and often perverse, so that not only do more of the poor people fail to receive the benefit, but those who are not amongst the most needy do. And finally, of course, these schemes are paternalistic, as they take away the recipient's capacity and freedom of action towards a realm of obligation. But with the orthodoxy, this was entirely predictable, because in defining inequality, they domesticated it as poverty. Reducing inequality meant reducing poverty. The policy makers, and indeed those who influence policies, are comfortable about helping the poor. Who isn't? All the major religions of the world, as well as secular humanist philosophy, command us to help the poor. However, insecurity is not just in the domain of the poor. There are many groups that are affected by it. But by focusing on the poor through the provision of access to services and safety net, allows them to airbrush the larger distribution structure. Again, to paraphrase Robert Wade, the problem is that if the larger structure is presented as a problem, then the policymakers are themselves a part of the problem. So you have to move away from that. We at the Basic Income Earth Network believe that more universal approaches tend to work much better, and it is in this vein that we have broached the idea of the universal basic income. We feel that a basic income would improve security more effectively than current mean-tested schemes which are directed at the poor only. If properly designed, a basic income should reduce the incidence of poverty, the number of people living in relative poverty, as well as the depth of poverty of anybody in or near the poverty line, whatever that might be. A basic income will not eradicate poverty. No policy by itself ever will. But it would go a long way in removing the threat of impoverishment for many. There have been many pilot surveys or pilot activities that have taken place, and they have been very, very encouraging so far as results concerned. And 2 days ago, we were given this happy news that although in Switzerland, at the federal level, they had rejected the idea of the basic security, 3 communes in Switzerland have now adopted basic income for the next couple of years. However, like everyone else, we too are ideologically biased. Why are we pushing for a universal basic income? Our ideological position starts with the notion of providing basic security to all. Basic security matters because without it, incentives to work, learn, and develop shrink and confidence wanes. Without it, people lose all sense of having control over their lives and then become dependent on the largesse of others. But basic income, basic security is not some airy or ethereal kind of a concept. What that we are promoting, it rests on 4 pillars. The first, that you need to have freedom for mobility. People cannot be expected to act freely and responsibly if they're on the margins of survival. They need a distance from catastrophe. A basically free and secure society may be defined in part as one in which all groups have an equal freedom from morbidity. Secondly, the same equality must apply when it comes to freedom from fear if basic security is to prevail. That the level of fear has to sort of go down. Third, the control of own development. This must include the capacity to acquire education and make decisions in freedom. A person must have the capacity to act and the ability to be able to deliberate and choose between alternatives. And the fourth is sustainable self-respect. There is a poverty of dignity as well as a poverty of food or income. The person who is deprived of food may rob or may fall prey to social illness. the person who's deprived of dignity may take more violent action. Look at the world today, right? Basic security matters because human freedom and dignity matter to all human beings. In fact, it could be reasonably argued that real freedom cannot exist unless a certain level of basic security exists. Freedom lies in that, the unimpeded capacity to establish one's ends, the capacity, time, and space to determine the way in which one will pursue those ends, and the capacity and to engage in that kind of a pursuit. This is the notion that also Amartya Sen has advanced in freedom as development. Underlying the value of freedom is human dignity. It is implicated both in the establishment of personal goals and in the pursuit of the means for achieving them. Human beings, we believe, must be able to choose for themselves who they are and who they will be. This is a self-definition. Thus, a good society would be one in which everybody, regardless of gender, age, religion, disability, and work status, has equal basic security. Basic security is a human need and a natural public good, since, unlike a typical commodity, one person having it does not mean the other person doesn't, right? Indeed, if others have security too, that should increase everyone's security, making it a superior public good. A universal basic income will in itself not bring about basic security. It must work in tandem with a larger social policy. What it can do is assist in the transformation towards a good society. My final comments on this is, what we're looking at, is it the beginning of the end of capitalism upon us? Admittedly, something that none of us yet can be certain of. Then the need to build movements that can move societies toward a better world is all the more a necessity. What you talked about, Rima, about the movements that have started against austerity measures and the others. Even if the final decay of capitalism has arrived, that decay is likely to unfold over decades, unless a global movement uniting the variety of social and environmental movements and struggles across the borders can speed up the process. The only other alternative is for inequality to get worse and the repression necessary to impose that inequality to get even more severe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this excellent keynote address. We have a coffee break now. We have half an hour, and this is because smoking is not allowed on AUB campus. So for smokers, please, you need to get outside the campus if you want to smoke. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Seiko Sugita. I'm a program specialist for social and human science at UNESCO Beirut office. It is my honor to chair the first session on World Social Science Report, its purpose, process, key findings, and recommendations. As a brief background, the first World Social Science Report was published in 1999, aiming to be a practical tool for investigating and assessing a set of social science disciplines which hold the key to a better understanding of so many aspects of society. 10 years after, the second report in 2010 addressed the very important theme of knowledge divides. The report reviewed social science knowledge production and use in different regions of the world and assessed how the social science evolving in the face of unequal conditions and diverging trends. The third report, produced in 2013 on changing global environments, was and still is an alarm to understand the environmental challenge in interconnections with a multitude of other crises, risks, and vulnerabilities which confront every society, and then also a concrete proposal to address social and economic and environmental dimensions of sustainable development in a single agenda. At a time when the world is seeking a new visions of sustainable development, the World Social Science Report thus must require reading for scientists, policymakers, activists, and all concerned citizens. Our fourth report on inequalities was launched in Stockholm in September 2016 and examines the harmful impact of inequalities on citizens, communities, and countries. The Arabic version is also made available at our website last week, thanks to the generous funding support of the Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saudi Foundation. It warns that unchecked inequalities could jeopardize the sustainability of economies, societies, and communities, undermining efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, by 2030. It also questions the role of social science to close the gap. So in this panel, we have three speakers, and our first intervention is by Professor Melissa Leach, who is the Director of Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. A geographer and social anthropologist, her interdisciplinary policy-engaged research in Africa and beyond links environment, agriculture, health, technology, and gender, with particular interest in knowledge, power, and politics of science and policy processes. She was the co-director of the World Social Science Report 2016. Unfortunately, due to the last-minute conflicting schedule, Professor Melissa was not able to join, but sent us a recorded intervention titled Challenging Inequalities, Multidimensional Perspectives. So I will start the video.
Hello there. I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to join you remotely for this really important launch of the Arabic translation of the World Social Science Report on Challenging Inequalities. And I want to talk today about the process of producing the report, why I think it matters, and why to be able to have it available to the Arab world is so very important. So the original report was produced in 2016. It involved more than 100 authors from 40 countries, including those in the Arab region. And the Institute of Development Studies, where I'm director, was the academic organisation that worked with the International Social Science Council and UNESCO to produce the report. We looked to produce a research agenda for the next 10 years, as well as to bring together a multiplicity of perspectives on the problem of inequality and what to do about it. So the context and why this topic was chosen is the way that inequality is looming large in the minds of businesses, governments, citizens, and the public at large around the world. That was important when the report was originally produced and is more important than ever. The context was also that governments, countries around the world have signed up to tackle inequality. The global goals, the SDGs, it is Goal 10, reducing inequalities. It's also this important cross-cutting principle to leave no one behind. But a new report, we felt, was needed because existing work had largely focused on economic inequality. It had focused principally on the global north, on Europe and North America. And we wanted to be able to document trends and analyse consequences in different places, as well as to look ahead, not just to analyse the problems, but to look to solutions, to think about strategies to reduce inequalities and what kinds of research would be needed to do that. So much of the report is about identifying critical knowledge gaps and proposing what a new agenda should look like. So what were some of the key messages? Well, one of the central messages was that inequalities are growing fast and they matter because they are rising. At a global level, we're seeing political and economic power increasingly concentrated in the hands of elites. These were figures from Oxfam in 2016. The trends have only intensified since then. So top levels of wealth, highly concentrated amongst a very, very few people. We also see trends whereby at a global level inequality declined during the first decades of this century, largely due to reductions in poverty in some of the really big countries, China and India in particular. But at the same time, rises in inequality within countries threaten to reverse even some of those trends at the global level, as well as to produce enormous problems in those countries themselves. And if we turn to the regional level analyses in the report, we find the Arab region, in the quote here by Adam Hanieh, who wrote that contribution, identified as one of those regions where inequalities are extremely pressing. They're rising in many countries, and they're causing enormous problems, but complex problems. And I think coming out of this quote is one of the key messages further from the report, which is that we must look beyond the economic. The inequalities that matter are not just those between rich and poor, vertical inequalities of income and assets. The report also identifies 6 further dimensions of inequality, often talking about inequalities, including the social, the cultural, political inequalities of voice and capacity to influence decisions, spatial inequalities, for instance, between urban and rural, or differently privileged parts of countries, environmental inequalities around resource access and control, vulnerabilities to pollution and exposure to threats, and very importantly, knowledge-based inequalities around access to knowledge and the legitimacy of certain types of knowledge. And it's that multiple set of dimensions that in turn underpin the report's analysis of intersecting inequalities, as defined here by Naila Kabir, those kinds of inequalities that occur when economic deprivation intersects with cultural and identity-based discriminations and indeed spatial disadvantages. Seen, for instance, in these examples from Nepal, with disparities in poverty, not just between ethnic groups, but also between hill areas and other parts of the country. And then we see often gender as a vital form of social inequality that can compound those other forms even further, as we see here in this example from Brazil. And we also see, and it's documented in the report, the way that intersecting inequalities can work across generations, working to restrict people's capacities to aspire to a different way of life. So, inequalities then are rising, they're important. But why are they important? The report's central argument is that inequalities are, at base, a moral matter. It's a question of fairness and justice, what kind of society we want to see locally, nationally, globally. But inequalities are also a practical matter because they threaten capacity to address other social, political, and economic goals and priorities. So, for instance, contributions to the report show how rising inequality impedes growth and certainly the ability of that growth to impact on reduced poverty. We see the impacts of rising inequalities on the health of democracies, and indeed that's something that's been seen a great deal in countries in the Arab region, especially when combined with non-representative and sometimes autocratic forms of state. Growing consensus too around the ways that rising inequalities, especially those horizontal group-based inequalities, are linked to conflict. Inequalities in access to knowledge, in playing into effects on education. And then others, life in our pressured planet, the Anthropocene, creating and exacerbating environmental inequalities and affecting the capacity to address environmental problems like climate change, for instance. Inequalities affecting how well we can respond to crises. An example in the report looked at how inequality in trust really limited the capacity to react to the big Ebola outbreak that affected West Africa just a few years ago. And inequality affecting food and nutrition, and in particular this stuff soft and starve phenomenon whereby highly unequal countries tend to have both high levels of malnutrition and often obesity and everything that flows from that in terms of health. So, if inequalities matter a great deal, we see them in the report as really central to the SDG framework. It's goal 10, but that goal 10 in turn, if we don't tackle that one, we're really going to struggle to tackle other goals around poverty, around gender, around health, around conflict, and those many goals in the SDG framework that relate to environmental sustainability. But the report doesn't just analyse the problems. It tries to look beyond them to look to the future. And it shows many cases and some really exciting examples of initiatives and frameworks that in different ways are helping to tackle inequalities and build a fairer world. And what we see is that there are many countries at different times and places, often over particular periods, from which we can learn. Parts of Southeast Asia earlier this century, parts of Latin America, for instance Brazil until quite recently, where there are positive country experiences from which we can draw lessons. Some of those lessons are that there are policies and programs that can help to rewrite the rules of economy and society, whether it's to do with laws around labour, redistribution, progressive taxation, or anti-discrimination policies, or indeed universal health and education coverage. There's a whole range. But what we also see is that one-off policies don't tend to work very well unless they're integrated with others in a package, and unless there's strong political commitment behind them. And their social and political action to push for that political will can be critical. What we also see is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And actually, the policies and packages that work tend to be embedded and attuned to the particular histories of inequality and policy and economy and society that have emerged in particular places. So in the US, for instance, effective inequality programs have to tackle race. There's very few ways around that. Whereas in Africa, questions about resource access and control and their distribution tend to lie at the heart of the way one needs to address inequality. One of the other key messages around approaches to change is that the top-down on its own is not enough. We often see some of the most effective ways forward where collective action from below, the work of citizens, social movements, and indeed micro-initiatives open up routes to then push for bigger changes. Or we see examples of quite small actions, whether it's initiatives to empower women and girls, whether it's grassroots mobilization, or whether it's alliances and coalitions amongst different actors, as in the very nice example from Egypt that Soha Bayoumi produced from the report, around building up support for universal health coverage, where initially small actions can begin to coalesce and form alliances with others, the little pathways becoming, if you like, the bigger motorways that eventually end up bringing about much more transformative change. So, if we're to move towards less inequality to tackle this new agenda, we also need to think about the knowledge produced about it. The final part of the report does some really interesting bibliometric analysis, which begins to show that actually there are really serious inequalities in the knowledge about inequality. That applies to subfields. So here we see a graph that shows that social science publications on inequality over the last couple of decades have been overwhelmingly dominated by those from economics and indeed from health sciences, which don't show up on this graph. But we also see an overwhelming dominance by region, and I find this really staggering, that more than 80% of publications about inequality have come out of North America and Western Europe, leaving enormous gaps in terms of the production of knowledge by and from the countries which are often experiencing the sharp end of global inequality. And that very much applies to the Arab states, which actually in this particular bibliometric analysis comes out at the very bottom, which is shocking because, of course, what we're missing there is really important, diverse regional experiences and analytical traditions. So when we begin to look towards the kind of research agenda that we need, this is the set of priorities that the final part of the report indicates. And they're about producing new knowledge, particularly in the places most affected by inequalities. They're about improving measurement. They're about creating more understanding of diverse experiences, as well as cross-cutting syntheses, and trying to develop a better understanding of how global and local forms of inequality interconnect. But more than this, more than a list of priorities which was produced in the report by a kind of survey amongst all the contributing authors, are some of the bigger arguments about the kind of step change which is now needed towards a more multidimensional and inclusive and, one might say, transformative agenda. One that goes beyond simply measuring inequality to understand through truly interdisciplinary work these intersecting forms. That goes beyond quantification to link measurement with really innovative participatory work and qualitative studies that can really capture inequalities as lived and experienced. And that then go beyond simply study and interdisciplinarity towards transdisciplinary, connected, engaged knowledge produced with citizens, businesses, policymakers and practitioners. And that in turn is part of not just producing more science, but actually challenging some of these inequalities of knowledge and the questions about whose knowledge counts. And this, I think, is perhaps where most of all language is key, because one of the key barriers, of course, has been that much of the debate has been conducted in English or in European languages. And opening up the debate about inequality to those who speak and prefer to communicate and write and read in their own languages is absolutely crucial. And of course, Arabic is a majority language amongst some of the key speakers and writers who already are and should be producing and making accessible their knowledge to the world. So if I have one wish for this really exciting Arabic translation, and indeed for this important roundtable which is launching this and stimulating these debates, is that we might begin to see much more inclusive debate, including perspectives from the Arab region itself and its many countries and diverse localities, to help build pathways to a more just future, both in the Arab region and beyond it. So I wish I was with you to be part of this exciting debate. I wish you all the best for it, and I hope you have a truly exciting discussion over the next couple of days that can begin to reshape the debate towards challenging inequalities from a multidimensional perspective. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
So now I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Professor Soha Bayoumi. Professor Soha is the Alston Burr Resident Dean of Kirkland House and Assistant Dean of Harvard College, and a lecturer in the Department of History of Science at Harvard University. Trained in political theory, political philosophy, and intellectual history, Professor Soha's research addresses the question of social justice with a thematic focus on health, biomedical ethics, and the links between medicine and politics, a geographic focus on the Middle East, and especially interest in post-colonial and gender studies. Professor Soha was a contributing author of the report. The title of her intervention is Health and Social Justice in Egypt, towards a health equity perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sika. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you here. I feel proud to have been included in this report as a contributor, an Arab contributor, and a person who's working on Egypt, particularly on the question of health. And I just have a few remarks that I would like to share with you about my contribution to this report and about maybe some of the developments that have happened since 2016, since the report came out, are interesting. And I'm really glad that Melissa talked about that in her intervention. There is kind of when people study the global south or the developing countries or low and middle income countries, however you want to call them, there's an interest in looking at aggregates, right, as opposed to looking at inequities or inequalities or social disparities. And so most of the literature that looks at what's happening in many Arab countries or in countries from the global south focus on health aggregates. And so they all look at how things are improving. Look at maternal mortality rates, they are improving. Look at child or infant mortality rates, they are improving. And that's all great, but then very little literature actually focuses on looking at the inequities or the inequalities within those indicators of health, those very important indicators of health. And of course, the issue is that there is a dearth of epidemiological and demographic studies that look at those inequities and study those disparities, let alone look at the intersections between those disparities and other disparities or other issues like how they intersect with income groups, with gender, with geographic location, with educational accomplishment, etc. In general, as I said, there have been improvements in aggregate health indicators over the past few decades in Egypt. However, those improvements mask striking inequalities among Egyptians by gender, by income level, education, and geographic location. And as I said, those health inequities intersect with inequalities among income groups and those related to gender, education, etc. And my contribution to the report looks at some of those numbers that are available, some of the figures that are already available from looking at the disparities in maternal mortality rates, for example, or access to prenatal care, infant and child mortality, or even inequities in healthcare financing. So, for example, the fact that the lowest income quintiles, for example, among Egyptians, pay a much higher percentage of their household incomes, or spend a much higher percentage of their household incomes on health care compared to the highest quintiles, for instance. What I also wanted to say, and I'm also glad that Melissa kind of referred to that or alluded to that in her intervention, is that there is a need to technicalize our understandings of inequalities, right? Inequalities are not just technical technical problems that require technical solutions. They are political and social problems that require political and social solutions. We can't really understand the context of inequalities in Egypt or in any other Arab country for that matter without understanding the political context that produces those inequalities. And we can't really ignore the consolidation of authoritarianism, the crackdown on civil society, and on all attempts to change, the healthcare system or reform the healthcare system if we're really serious about studying inequalities. So I think the push for politicization, even though it can be dangerous at times, in contexts of, authoritarianism, but it is important, and I think without it, we will probably be wasting our time. And so I also, one of the points I also tried to make in my contribution is that, even though it's common wisdom that the crisis, a crisis in the healthcare sector can be representative of a general crisis in the public sector or in public services in general, it is important to look at the specifics of each sector. And so I kind of, an example of that I tried to do in my contribution was to draw some kind of comparison between health and education in Egypt and look at how, even though there are huge problems in both sectors in Egypt, certain mobilizations to reform education or at least to improve the status, say, of teachers in public schools in Egypt has been relatively more successful than efforts by physicians, by doctors, for example, working in public hospitals in order to reform the healthcare system, but also to improve their working conditions, their salaries, their training opportunities, etc. And I kind of try to explain that by resorting to an analysis of some economic factors and some geopolitical factors as well related to the relative demand placed on both physicians and teachers from both the private sector in Egypt and from the Gulf, from Gulf countries. What I tried to argue for ultimately in my contribution is that there is a need to move beyond what is referred to as a health systems approach, which can be defined as, a health systems approach allows us to see the big picture, right? But not the inequities among different social groups or the structural determinants beyond the health system, to what we can call a health equity approach that would prioritize the most vulnerable groups and those who are most in need, and would also shed light on the suffering of some social groups that are completely invisible today. I have also tried to highlight some of the efforts by groups, especially doctors, actually, in Egypt, who have fought to reform the health system, especially, for over 10 years now, since 2007 at least, but more importantly, since 2011, and of course, the relative successes and most importantly, failures of their mobilization. It's interesting to note that through my field work and my many interviews with doctors in Egypt, people have often framed their mobilization to reform the health system in terms of, fighting corruption or, increasing efficiency in the system, improving the system as a whole. But very few doctors actually paid attention to the question of inequalities, existing inequalities in the system. And as I said, it may be because of the dearth of epidemiological and demographic studies that document those inequalities. This may be what is preventing the fight, if you will, or the mobilization from being framed as one that is addressed against inequalities. But there have been some attempts. For example, so since the publication of the report in 2016, last year Egypt passed its new health insurance law, which is, according to some, a step in the right direction towards universal health care. However, it's extremely problematic on many other fronts. And some of the critiques that were addressed at the new healthcare law is that it actually has fixed premiums. So the premiums are not dependent on, are not progressive, or are not dependent on how much a person is making or the income, household income. And then there are also co-payments, of course, and those can be actually prohibitive. Co-payments are percentages of services rendered, and those can be prohibitive for those at the lowest income percentiles. And so some of the there has been some awareness, if you will, among those who were criticizing the new health insurance law regarding its effect on existing inequities, specifically when it comes to access to health care, and how this might even worsen some people's access to health care, or can be prohibitive for many people in Egypt. I'm basically, as I said, arguing that when we adopt a health equity approach, as we think about reforming the health system in Egypt, we need to think about inequities and evaluate all policy, not just healthcare policy in the strict sense, but all policy in general, to look at how those policies might affect different social groups differently. A serious commitment to addressing inequalities will have to do that, because health, like many other things, but health in particular, is one of those things that are not only affected by how much the percentage of spending on health alone, that of course is very important, but it's also affected by many other factors, environmental factors, education, income distribution, income and wealth distribution, etc. So it is transportation, everything basically can be construed as a health policy in some form or another. And so it is really important to look at the multifarious effects of policy on health, and on and the differential consequences, if you will, of those policies on health. I will probably stop here, and I look forward to your questions and comments and engagements with this. And thank you again for listening. Thank you very much.